welcome to Wild Heart Yoga Holistic Healing. My name is Hannah Ray. I'm a master's level clinical mental health counselor and a certified yin yoga therapy instructor. And I created this channel to offer some holistic tools for helping manage chronic pain and or mental health. So this month I've been releasing a series called my Beginners Yin and Yang Foundation series. And since I have this month focused on my beginner students, I wanted to offer a video with some tips for my beginners as well as background on what yoga is and what it isn't. And I'm also going to offer some tips for basic form and alignment issues to help you start with a solid foundation, as well as going into some of the differences between yin and yang style yoga classes. So let's get right into it. Before we get into what yoga is, let's talk about what it isn't, because there are some common misconceptions. One common misconception being that yoga is a religion. Yoga originated in India and has been practiced for thousands of years, but it is not tied to any one religion, although it can be applied to any really. Yoga is a lifestyle philosophy that is intended to help bring balance, harmony, and self-realization into your life. Another common misconception is that yoga is just about the physical practice. It's just about the poses, and the better, more advanced poses you can do, then the better yogi you are. Well, that is also a misconception, because anyone who practices yoga in any form, whether it's on the mat or off the mat, is considered a yogi. And with that being said, it's important to note that yoga does go beyond the mat. It is not just about this physical practice. The traditional yoga theory actually has 8 limbs to it, and I'm not going to go into a lot of depth with those specific details, but I am going to give an overview of some of the different ways that yoga can be applied to your life besides just the physical practice. The word yoga means union, and we're talking about the union of body, mind, and spirit. And so through the different philosophies of yoga and how it can be applied to our lives, it's meant to bring, again, that balance and harmony to our lives, greater self-awareness. The highest goal of yoga is also the union of individual consciousness with universal consciousness. So it's this idea that we are all interconnected somehow, all living beings. And so this is something that not everyone experiences, but some people speak to, and I'm not going to go a lot into depth about it because people have kind of different opinions about that and what that's like, what that experience is like, or how that happens. And so I'll just leave you with that definition, and we will move on to our discussion of asanas. So asana is the physical practice of yoga. It is the poses we do on our mat. It's showing up to yoga classes and flowing with the breath or holding poses for a long time. And the goal of yoga is to improve form and alignment, improve flexibility and strength, as well as increase body awareness, your relationship with your body, to help promote peace of mind and clarity, as it can help to regulate the nervous system. So we have different styles of yoga. There are many different names of different types of yoga. I specialize in yin yoga therapy, and yin yoga is kind of in a very different category than most of the other yogas, because most yoga would be considered yang. It's about engaging your muscles, and so you're going not as deep into the muscles with the flexibility and with the release, because those muscles are engaged. But with yin yoga, or maybe restorative yoga even, any poses that are held for 3 minutes plus in a relaxed and passive state. So with this, we are actually relaxing the muscles, not engaging them, resting passively, and creating space for the fascia to release. The fascia is the thinnest layer of connective tissue that runs through our whole body, and also 80% of our nerve pathways end in the fascia. And so this is really important to understand how the mind and body are connected here. So when we have unprocessed emotions, heightened stress, trauma, etc., and those neural signals are completed, we can store physical energy, store that emotional energy in the fascia itself. And so yin yoga is unique in being able to release the fascia and help release stored emotional energy. If you want to learn more about yin yoga specifically, I have a video which I'll link in the description below called What is Yin Yoga? And I talk about the principles and components of the practice. I want to go back to the fascia discussion for just a second and the nervous system, because with my counseling background, this is where this practice is really beneficial and why I recommend it for both chronic pain and mental health management. So with both pain or stress or trauma, when you're in that fight or flight type state of your nervous system, your nervous system is activated, your heart rate's higher, your blood pressure is typically higher. Anyway, there's a lot of different things that can happen. But there's a connection between what's happening in your nervous system, and that looks similarly with both pain and sometimes with anxiety or with reactiveness. So through this practice of breathing mindfully, finding a meditative state of mind, and releasing the fascia, is helping to regulate the nervous system. So this is how the practice can really help you to manage the chronic pain and mental health issues potentially. But I will throw in here that I am not a doctor. None of my videos or content is intended to diagnose or treat individual issues, so please seek individualized care from your healthcare professional before beginning any new exercise or diet regimens. All right, so the next aspect of yoga is the pranayama or breath control. And so this can be applied during your physical asana practice in the poses or outside of the practice. So there are many different techniques and types of breath control you can do. Most of them are used to help regulate the nervous system, calm the body, calm the mind. In the physical practice with our asanas, using the breath also helps us to relax our muscles deeper so we can release even further into our poses. So that can be used to help us go deeper into our physical practice, as well as going deeper into a meditative state of mind by helping to be an anchor for our awareness. Which that takes me to our next point, which is meditation or the mindfulness aspect of yoga. Again, this can be within the physical practice or within just life in general. And so all these aspects really can and should be applied within and without of the physical practice. So let's clear up a common misconception about meditation. I've heard so many times before from people, I've tried to meditate, but I can't do it. I'm so bad at it. I can't clear my mind, and so on. So many things like this. And that's because people assume that meditation is all about having zero thoughts, emptying your mind, being like a monk who has meditated 16 hours a day for 10 years. Like, of course, none of us are going to be perfect at that, especially when we live in a very overstimulating world. We're used to being fed information constantly all the time. And so turning off that mind is really difficult. That's also why this practice can be so beneficial, because we are overstimulated so much. But the real goal with meditation, instead of completely emptying the mind, is to be aware of thoughts and emotions as they enter. So going back to the breath, we can use the breath in this practice to anchor our awareness too. So we try to focus on that, because when your attention is one place, it's harder for it to be on something else. So we focus on the breath and just noticing the rise and the fall. But every time you notice the mind has wandered and you're thinking about something else again, just take note of what you're thinking about. Take note of any emotional consequences that this thought is having. And then without judgment, just see if you can let that go. Bring your attention back to the breath again. And we do this again and again and again. And this creates the opportunity for neuroplasticity to take place, which is the rewiring of neural pathways. So we're learning new ways to think, to respond, to react. So instead of those automatic ways that have been formed over years of our previous experiences, we're learning to take back control by increasing our self-awareness, being aware of how our thoughts affect our emotional reality. And over time, you can begin to notice, oh, I spend a lot of time thinking about this thing, and when I think about this thing, it makes me really upset. And maybe for a long time, you feel like you don't have any control of whether or not you think about it. You can't help it. But through this practice, over time, you can begin to realize, I actually do get to choose where I turn my attention to. And every time it wanders somewhere that's not helpful for me in that moment, I can choose to shift it back again and again and again, practicing this habit. And so this is how meditation and mindfulness can be really helpful for our practice physically as well as just in life in general. Also, with this mindfulness in the practice and in our lives in general, as you begin to be more aware of how your habits, how your thoughts and things impact you, then eventually it begins to get easier to maybe notice things in your life, little things that you could change that can make a big difference to help just find overall more balance in your life. So if you're a skeptic like I was at one time, I really encourage you to give meditation a chance. Like, try it for a while consistently before you make up your mind about it. The first time I tried it, I remember sitting there thinking about how stupid and pointless it was. And of course, it doesn't work when you're not actually open-minded about it, invested in it. One thing that really got me more open-minded to it was looking at the research behind meditation, why it works, how it helps, and then that helps me buy into it more. and then be really willing to give it more of a chance. And so I'd encourage you, if you're a skeptic, just go and look at some of the research. Give it a try, even if it's 5 minutes a day. Just start with something and try and see how it can impact your life. All right, so moving on, after the meditation mindfulness parts of yoga, we also can consider the ethical principles. And so in yoga, these are called the Yamas and Niyamas, and they're essentially the do's and don'ts. And these include things like nonviolence, and this can mean physically as well as violence in your thoughts toward other people or in your words or towards yourself, perhaps. So nonviolence is one example. Truthfulness, non-possessiveness. These can include cleanliness, self-control. So these are all kind of just principles or guidelines on how to live a more peaceful and harmonious life. Some of these concepts can be applied or talked about a little bit in yoga classes. I also, with my counseling background, consider a lot of counseling concepts and values, things I would ask people in counseling sessions, and integrate those sort of into the narratives I'm using or the language for my classes to help people reflect on things or maybe go inward to some deeper levels than maybe most westernized yoga classes will go. The next component of yoga and the yoga philosophy is diet and nutrition. And so there are no hard and fast guidelines for this, although there are certain ones that people talk about. When I was in India for my training, we had to eat the sattvic diet, which is it was vegan, but no garlic or onions either. I don't know exactly what it is, so I'm not going to look it up if you're interested. But anyway, the idea though is just about being aware, being intentional and mindful about your diet and nutrition, trying to eat a relatively clean diet to nourish your body, to nourish your mind. So not eating foods that make you feel like crap or perform like crap, essentially. So it's kind of common sense here. I'm not going to give specific guidelines on this. It's basically just something to be aware of, is that how you fuel yourself, fuel your mind, fuel your body is important, and that is considered something important within the yoga philosophy. Another component of yoga philosophy is self-realization. And so this can be beginning to understand more about your meaning or purpose in life, exploring those things, being curious about who you are, why you are, how you react the ways you do, really just having a lot of self-inquiry. And so this can be applied again while you're on the mat. It could be things you reflect on in meditation or just throughout life in general. Always being curious about yourself. It's always a good thing to be curious about why we speak the ways we do, why we think the way we do, why we react the way we do. And as I just said a few moments ago, this is why I include some of the concepts I do with the narrative I provide in my yoga classes to help you reflect on things that may take the practice a little deeper for you. The last component of yoga philosophy I want to cover today is non-attachment. So this idea of non-attachment is non-attachment or non-possessiveness to material things. It's also non-attachment to our ideas, to our plans. And so this is something that I think many of us really struggle with, especially if you're someone with anxiety or control issues at all. It can be really hard to let go of the ideas we have for ourselves or the goals, to let go of disappointment. And so this can be applied in many different ways. On the mat, this can look like letting go of the ego, and when you really want to do the advanced pose, listening to your body when it's telling you to take a modified variation. And so non-attachment can be applied in so many areas and really can be a life-changing concept if you can apply it and adopt it into your life. Okay, so now that I've covered a bit about what yoga is and isn't, let's talk about some tips for beginners. The very first thing I want to start with is simply having grace for yourself. Show up as you are, where you're at, without forcing anything, with self-honesty, and meet yourself there. That is the best place to always be in any practice, not with goals or with expectations in mind, but to just come as you are and to be really kind to yourself in this process. Yoga is a process that will really help you grow in ways over time if you allow it to, if you trust the process, but it is not something to be forced. So whenever you show up for your physical practice, let the ego go, let go of those concerns about what you look like or how you want to appear, and just show up with self-honesty. The next tip that I want to talk about, which is one of the biggest things I try to encourage people, is consistency over volume. You're going to get much more benefit from even doing 5-10 minutes a day of yoga or meditation, whatever the practice is, rather than doing it once a week for an hour, because you're building over time. It's taking baby steps. And when you just do something once sporadically, it's not going to have the same building effect to change your body, change your mind over time in the same way that it can by just the consistent habit. I think people often assume that because I teach yoga that I practice a lot. In reality, a good week for me is doing 20 minutes about 5 or 6 days a week. A lot of days I have a very busy life as well, and I work part-time. It's a lot of days in the mornings I'm doing some stretches before the work starts really going, or it's in between recording voiceovers. I'll stop and I'll do a few stretches, or even before I go into work in the morning, instead of looking at my phone and scrolling, deciding to take a few deep mindful breaths. And so these are just small ways that I try to fit these practices into my day-to-day life, even when I'm busy. I tell people, look at what the minimum commitment is. What's the smallest amount I say I can do every day? I know I can do it no matter how busy I am. And so a lot of times I encourage people to start with 5 minutes, because sometimes if it's 15 or more, people end up not having the time for it. So starting with whatever is possible for you to do. And maybe it's not every day, maybe it's at least 3 days a week, but starting with just a small step. So what's the first small step you can take? And beginning to just apply some small improvements, some small sustainable change into your life. The next thing I want to talk about is functional versus aesthetic alignment. So aesthetic alignment is what it sounds like. It's about looking good. It's about the pose looking pretty and perfect. And you see this more in vinyasas or ashtanga type yogas. But then we also have functional alignment, which is what we focus on more with yin yoga therapy. And it's more about adapting the pose to your body. So functional alignment recognizes that not everyone's bone structure is the same. What's possible for some people is really not physically possible for others. So this could be in a down dog instead of having your arms out here. If you have a different bone structure, your arms may have to be a little wider or hands slightly turned out to protect your wrists. It could also mean that you may never be capable of doing the splits. If you get to the point where your hips are bone on bone, then it's not physically possible for your bone structure. I think I probably will not be able to do the middle splits ever. So keep that in mind. Don't force yourself to be able to do something or to try to get into a pose that your body may not be capable of doing, and that's okay. With this being said, also in the yoga practice, always take some micro adjustments. I always encourage people to do this. Just moving ever so slightly with the pose, tucking your hips, squaring them out, taking these tiny little movements in order to feel out the pose, feel your body in the pose. Notice how these small adjustments can make a big difference in the area being affected by the stretch, and so forth. All right, so let's go over just a few basic tips now for form and alignment things to think about in the classes. So one thing that I talk about a lot in my classes, you'll hear me say square off your hips or pull the back hip forward and the front hip back slightly. And so this is the idea that we want to keep our hips square and aligned to the front of the mat. Like if we're in a lunge or something, you're moving that back hip forward. So always be thinking about keeping the hips level so they aren't doing this or this in different poses. And again, take those micro adjustments to play around with this, to notice how the squaring of the hips can change the effectiveness of the pose a lot. Another general form and alignment tip is to have the shoulder blades rolled down and back. And this is a good neutral position with the spine. Whenever we're sitting or standing, we have the hips tucked under, belly button pulled into the spine, and the shoulder blades down and back. So we have a nice engaged core, nice straight spine. Finding a tall spine is something that we do frequently throughout the yoga practices. So that is just some basic tips for getting started there. The next tip is folding from the hips. So anytime you do a forward fold, you're bending forward, I really want to emphasize folding from the hips first. So with this means that we aren't bending over with the arch in the low back here, but we're starting with a flat back, that belly button into the spine. We fold from the hips as far as you can before the rest of the upper body can fall forward. And that is with any forward folding pose. So just something to be aware of that helps protect the back. You can also keep a slight bend in the knees to protect the back as well, especially if you have any low back pain. So slight bend in the knees if you're doing a forward fold, bending from the hips as far as you can. And also, if you have any low back pain, you may want to just stay forward bend it as far as you can with the straight spine without allowing the chest and head to follow the rest of the way forward. Speaking of pain, there are some contraindications with some of our yoga poses. So anytime we are doing inversions where the head is below the heart, so we're leaned back or doing some kind of back bend, the head below the heart, then these are poses that should be avoided by those with high blood pressure, glaucoma, or any other upper body infection at all for that matter. That's because when you're leaning backwards, more pressure, more blood flow is going to that area of the body, and so we don't want that if there are any issues going on there. If there's a pose in the class that has a back bend, you can still place something under your back, but then also use a pillow to support the head so it's still up above the heart, depending on the poses. But again, just be mindful of that. Another thing to be aware of is that yin yoga should be practiced differently if you are pregnant. Pregnant women's bodies release relaxin, which is this hormone which allows the body to become more flexible, to stretch more in preparing for delivery of the baby, of course. And because of this, though, it can be easy to overstretch. So if you're doing any yin yoga class or deep stretching while pregnant, only go 50% as far as you can. And don't go any further than that because we don't want to overstretch and cause injuries and lose stability because there's too much mobility happening. Another thing I want to be sure to emphasize is that if you are working through trauma or really difficult emotions or in crisis, I really recommend being one-on-one with a talk therapist as well, in addition to doing yin yoga therapy. Although my classes can help release stored emotional energy, it is not, again, intended to treat or diagnose individuals, and releasing stored emotional energy can sometimes be really intense for people if there's a lot going on there, a lot that hasn't been processed yet. And so be sure that you have the proper support in place before beginning these types of classes. The last thing I want to briefly discuss is just the use of props, especially in yin yoga classes. So in my yin classes, I often use props, or occasionally do, for back bends especially, or I will recommend them for modifying poses. So for props, some things I recommend having around if you don't have traditional yoga props like a block and bolster or a yoga strap. Some other things to have around for the practice can be a pillow, a rolled blanket, some kind of rope or towel that you can use as a strap. But be creative with what you have around your house. You don't need all the fancy or expensive yoga gear and equipment or clothing to be able to show up to practice yoga. Just come as you are, find what you have available to you, and make it work. It's not about it being perfect, it's just about adapting with what you have available to you and, again, meeting yourself where you're at. All right, that is all that I have for you today. Once again, if you would like to learn more about yin yoga therapy, check out the link in the description below for my What is Yin Yoga Therapy Principles and Components video. If you want to learn more about some other tips for beginners, I have a tips playlist with some form tips and other things like that on my channel page as well, which I recommend checking out to give you some other tips for a solid foundation in your yoga journey. If you enjoyed this video, please help me out by giving it a thumbs up, and be sure to subscribe to follow along with my weekly classes as they're released. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you soon.